Welcome to Before and After Katrina, Black Education in New Orleans, a forum sponsored by the Program for African and African Diaspora Studies at Tulane University, by the Scott Cowan Institute for Public Education Initiatives, and the Deep South Regional Humanities Center. My name is Nagana Lewis. I'm a professor, associate professor in the Department of English and Program for African and African Diaspora Studies here at Tulane University. I'd like to begin by thanking a few people who have made today possible, and I'd like to start with individuals from the Cowan Institute who have been very, very supportive in organizing materials and publicizing the event and ensuring that we have a broad representation from the community. Ms. Shannon Jones, Amy Argenti, and Felicia Brown. I'd also like to thank Sheldon Jones, who was very instrumental in helping me to coordinate the audio-visual taping of today's session, which will be available. It will be deposited at the Homicide Research Center and available to researchers and educators and anyone else who's interested in follow-up review of today's sessions. I'd also like to thank Carol Haber, who's the Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, who was supportive of this initiative from the outset, and the committee members of the Deep South Regional Humanities Center who provided generous support for today's event. And the same holds true for the Cowan Institute. Our objective today is quite simple. It's to contribute to the dialogue that has been ongoing about public school education in the city of New Orleans, the various reform efforts that have been underway, especially since Hurricane Katrina, which will mark the 5-year anniversary in late August. We would also hope to use today as an opportunity to learn from participants what sort of follow-up engagements you would like to have. For example, if there are workshops that we can organize around particular issues that have been introduced by our speakers today, we would welcome the opportunity to facilitate that initiative. And so toward that end, what I would ask is that if you haven't had the opportunity yet, at some point before you leave today, if you would, please sign in. There's a sign-in sheet at the table outside where we're requesting your name, at mailing address, email address, and affiliation so that there can be systematic follow-up communications. This is not a one-shot event. It is oriented primarily toward continuing the dialogue and gaining information that we can use in order to continue to act on behalf of our young people in the city of New Orleans, on behalf of their interests. Today, assisting me in introducing our guest speakers is Mr. Richard Como. He is a second-year BA candidate, triple majoring in philosophy, African and African Diaspora Studies, and sociology. He currently sits on the executive board of the African American Congress of Tulane and the current youth issues coordinator for the Greater New Orleans After School Partnership. His research interests include naive psychology, urban education pedagogy, hip-hop as a culture, and socially deviant culture. He's an active member of the fight for equality in Orleans Parish Public Schools and a product of Orleans Parish Public Schools, having graduated from Oliver Perry Walker College and Career Preparatory Charter High School and Community Center under the direction of Principal Mary L.H. Laurie. So without further ado, I'd like for Richard to come and make the first introductions of our guest speakers.
Before I start, it's very significant that we make sure that we give applause to ourselves, because without all the people in this room, this definitely would not be possible. So maybe we should give a hands to everyone that's in here. And also, Dr. Nagana Lewis, who's often very modest of herself. So good morning. How we feeling today? Good, good, good. We excited? We ready to get started? Please excuse my voice. I'm coming off a viral infection, so it might go in and out. So our first speaker today He's a Suzanne and Weiss Presidential Fellow, an Associate Professor of Psychology and African Diaspora Studies at Tulane University, earned his PhD at Emory University, and completed his post-doctoral fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania, prior to joining Tulane's faculty in 1996. His primary research interests include examining adolescent development in diverse contexts and special emphasis in resilience and vulnerability in African American youth. His development psychology and research and human development work is top tier. I mean, honestly, especially here at Tulane University, very few surpass him. A personal mentor of myself. The title of Dr. Cunningham's presentation is Resilience Before the Levees Broke, an examination of achievement patterns in African American adolescents. Please welcome Dr. Michael Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm really honored to have Richard introduce me. I met Richard when he was a high school student, so I'm really proud to see his growth and development. And he's an example of resilience before the levees broke, and so it was very appropriate to have him here. I also wanted to explain my title. I tend to use before the levees broke because most of the devastation that happened in New Orleans was the result of the levees breaking post-Hurricane Katrina. I joke with people about how I had hurricane damage on my house because I had to get a new roof because of Hurricane Katrina, but I had no flooding because I lived in uptown New Orleans versus other areas in New Orleans had hurricane damage and levee damage, and the levee damage really sort of devastated the city a lot more. One of the things that I want to do today is to also expand on this notion of resilience, but also talking about vulnerability and introduce this concept called defiance. I want to talk about the New Orleans population pre-levee failure. I want to talk about gender differences in adolescence. And of course, when you talk about adolescence, you cannot ignore issues of identity. And then give you some empirical examples with some of my research. First, when I talk about resilience, I'm talking about a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity, which means you have to be exposed to some significant adversity, then have positive adaptation associated with that as well. Now, thinking about this, we can also note that resilience is a multidimensional construct, that some people may be exposed to significant adversity and do quite well in terms of their educational outcomes, but then have challenges in terms of mental health, or vice versa. When I talk about vulnerability, I'm talking about something that Sunil Luthar and some of her colleagues describe as vulnerability as when mental health or behaviors are weakened under challenging situations, which also means, and they quote, overall disadvantage or challenge is heightened with increasing levels of stress. So you're exposed to some negative things and you get worse because of it. And they call this vulnerable and reactive. I like this term defiance, and I first read about this by a guy named Ed Gordon. Ed Gordon talks about this, and he said, defiance builds on resilience, but individuals take an active part in positively adapting to challenge. So you're not just exposed to something and you're doing well, you are actively confronting that. And he says, quote, acts of active resistance to a challenge and pushing against obstacles standing in the way of personal achievement. And so those are the three concepts that I want to use to sort of couch my talk. I want to talk about resilience in terms of when you're being exposed to adversity and you positively adapt. I want to talk about vulnerability and you're exposed to adversity and become more susceptible to risk. And then I want to talk about defiance in terms of these active resistance to challenges as well. There are many factors that are associated with resilience, vulnerability, and defiance. Wrong way. One, we do know that people who are resilient tend to have a lot of social support. But social support can also be multidimensional, and so I'm going to talk about social support a little bit in terms of social support from mother, father, school personnel, and grandparents. Self-esteem is an obvious aspect as well. People who feel good about themselves tend to be more successful, and the opposite is also true as well. We do know for adolescents in particular, adolescents who are involved in extracurricular activities, whether that's being on a sports team or attending faith-based organizations, those extracurricular activities also tend to buffer negative things and help promote resilience. There are also things about who we are as individuals, our personality. There's a term like ego resiliency. So these people who have this hardiness of character, I like to try new and unusual things. Like, it's very hard for things to sort of ruffle their feathers. But then we all have stressful events that sort of occur as well. And so I'm going to look at stressful events, and sometimes I may call them negative events, as sort of my sort of concept of adversity. And so when I think about these notions of stressful events, when I talk about adversity, I'm going to talk about stuff like circumscribed events, like within the last year. Do you know someone in your family that's passed away, or a close friend who passed away? Things like life transitions, which are normative for adolescents. I've had a lot of body changes. I went to a new school. Behavioral problems, such as having detention or a serious teacher confrontation. A daily hassle, like just get into an argument with one of your friends, or miscellaneous things like being dropped from a sports team. Now, any one of those things may not make you vulnerable, but the research is really clear that 6 of those things totaling starts to make you much more vulnerable. And so you may have one of those challenges and you do okay, but having maybe a grandparent die, dealing with going to a new school, dealing with having increased arguments with your parents, dealing with the teacher confrontation, all those things put together may make you much more vulnerable to things as well. So that's how I'm going to look at stressful events. But also, when I talk about resilience, I'm going to talk about this in the context of positive future expectations. And when we do research with kids, we sort of talk to them and say, well, 10 years from now, do you expect to be politically active, have a good job? And we do know that adolescents who tend to look forward tend to be much more resilient. They have something to work towards. I'm going to talk about depressive symptoms when I talk about vulnerability. And one of the reasons I talk about depressive symptoms is I'm actually going to give an example with African American females with depressive symptoms, because during elementary school, boys and girls tend to present with depressive symptoms at about the same rate. But girls start presenting with depressive symptoms at higher numbers during the teenage years. And then when I talk about this notion of defiance, I want to talk about stuff like, I plan to go to graduate school after I finish college. I plan to go to college. Even given all the risks and the challenges of going to some of the schools that I go to, I'm going to have these serious positive outcomes as well. I'm going to look at that in terms of how social support, again, is associated with these factors. And I'm going to look again at mother support. I like to look at dad support as well, because one of the things we do know, regardless of whether fathers are in the home or not, that men are playing active roles in the lives of children. We can think about self-esteem as another buffer to that one as well. Ego resiliency is sort of one of those buffers that sort of gets you through things, to having this personal sense of character. And so I'm moving now, and I'm moving fast. I can keep to my 30-minute limit. And so if I'm going too fast, say, hey, just wave your hand, say, slow up a little bit. When we think about sort of males and females in New Orleans pre-Levee failure, we can see in New Orleans that we were a population of majority females. The orange is the male, and the darker color are females. About 53% of our population was female, which compared to about 52% in Louisiana and about 51% nationally. If we think about the racial background of the New Orleans population pre-Levee failure, we were a city that was majority black. About 66%, between 66 and 67% of our population was African American or black. And that's higher than Louisiana and also in the United States as well. We also were a population of never married population. It was the highest category. A little bit over 40% of the residents in New Orleans pre-Katrina were never married. And that's higher than Louisiana and in the United States. And then we think about sort of people who are under 18 in terms of household children under 18 and their living status. In terms of kids who are under 18, the majority of kids who are under 18 who lived in New Orleans lived in mom-only households. At about 38% of all kids lived in mom-only households pre-Katrina, and that's higher than Louisiana and in the United States. And you can see that the third bar is the married parents. That second bar is dad. We have a higher number of students who are also living with grandparents only in pre-Katrina in New Orleans than in the Louisiana and the United States and, as well. So moving then to this notion of adolescence. When we think about adolescence, we can think about this whole construct of this increased self-awareness. One of the things, I teach an undergraduate class called adolescent psychology, and I talk about this notion of personal fable, imaginary audience. And I always joke and I ask students if they've seen that Drew Barrymore movie, Ever After, when she plays Cinderella and she walks into a room, the ballroom at the ball, and the whole room just opens up. And oftentimes, that's how adolescents feel when they walk into a room. It's like, everybody's looking at me. You know, it's a normative time of change and challenge. And there are two time periods in our life where there's rapid growth and development, 0 to 2 and during adolescence. The early part of adolescence, there's a lot of biological stuff that's going on. So you have an increase in things like acne. And what do adolescents do? Like, oh, I have a pimple on my head. I'm going to put a Band-Aid over it so nobody will notice it, which brings more attention to it. This increased self-awareness is there. They also are more socially mobile. In elementary school, our parents tend to take us places. But as we turn to teenagers start riding a streetcar on their own, riding a bus on their own. So they're also starting to perceive the world as independent individuals. Now, this is coupled with an increased cognitive ability, too. They're starting to think abstractly. No longer is it my mommy, my daddy. I'm thinking about what will happen to me if I do something in a different way. So that also makes this self-awareness heightened as well in terms of who am I and who would I want to be as an adult man or a woman. And so they start to experiment with adult roles as men and women as well. Do I want to wear a certain outfit because it makes me look older? Do I want to walk a certain way because it makes me feel cool? And so these roles are very evident. These are normative challenges and things that adolescents go to. But also these traditional notions of identity, like independence and autonomy, are very male-focused. In that, you know, we think about adolescents as like, I want to be my own individual and all these kind of things. The research is very clear. That's very male-focused. Females, for example, they value relationships. And relationships with adults are heightened during this particular time period. And so interdependence becomes much more important during this particular time period. And so one of the things that I like to do in my research is actually talk to adolescents. And I use this African proverb to sort of denote what I mean as well, that the lion's story will never be told as long as the hunter is the one who tells it. Adolescents will tell you how they feel, what they feel, and where you can go about what they feel as well. So to the bulk of my presentation would be empirical examples of how I've looked at some of these things as well. The first example is the association of stressful events, parental monitoring, and future expectations of African American adolescents. This was a group of 206 students, high school students who were public school students who attended a science and math school for half the day, and then their home school for half the day. I consider these students high achieving just for the fact that they went out of their way to attend this science and math school. The only interest in going to the only requirement to go to this school is an interest in science and math. Approximately 80% of the students received free lunch, and about 46% of the students lived with one parent. We expect that stressful events would have a negative association to future expectations. However, parental monitoring would lessen this potential negative relationship. And I'm going to explain what parental monitoring is in a second. We also expect the gender differences too. That based on past research, females report more parental monitoring and less stressful events than males. As I said before, in terms of looking at adversity, I'm looking at stressful events. And the events ran the gamut of stressful events from failing a test at school to witnessing community violence, as well as, having a family member who passed away, all those kinds of things. We used the total scale. Parental monitoring are things like, from a kid's perspective, it's a hassle. It's like my parents are bugging me about being at the dinner table one time, asking me, where am I going? What are you wearing? But from the parents' perspective, it's parental monitoring. It's saying, yes, I need to know who your friends are. Who are you talking to on the telephone? And so from a kid's perspective, it's a hassle. From the parents' perspective, it's parental monitoring. Future expectations is a self-report measure of future happiness and success. And the students responded to questions that would occur 10 years in the future. For example, I would have a good job. I would have a positive attitude toward life, be politically active, be proud of myself, those kind of things. And the research is very clear that students with high future expectations tend to be more resilient than students who are not. When looking at the stressful events, our results indicate that 99% of students reported at least one stressful event happened within the last year. And The darker line is yes, and that greenish color line is the no, looking at the different kinds of stressful events. The first one, that circumscribed events, about 48% sort of had someone, either a close friend or a relative, pass away within the last year. As you would expect with the adolescent population, the majority of the students had, life transitions, body changes, going to different schools, that kind of stuff. Behavioral problems, about 70% reported behavioral problems in the last year. And the behavioral problem, again, are things like detention, suspension, serious teacher confrontation. Community violence, a little bit over 50% of the students reported being exposed to community violence within the last year. The community violence things were like, I personally know someone who was killed. I've seen someone get stabbed. Not just from TV, but things that happened in my neighborhood. Daily hassles, I had an argument with my friend coming to school, and miscellaneous things like I didn't make a sports team that I tried out for. I didn't make a club I was a part of as well. There were gender differences in that females reported higher levels of parental monitoring and less stressful events. And those things were statistically significant. And with the exceptions of behavioral problems, there were no gender difference in overall stressful events or future expectations. And so this is the parental monitoring sort of slides looking at gender differences in parental monitoring. And again, the darker ones are females, and that greenish color are males. And as you can see in each category, females are monitored more than males, and those differences are statistically significant. And the only statistically significant difference between the stressful events are behavior problems. Boys reported more behavior problems than girls. The other stressful events were not, there were no gender differences in looking at those. And so again, I was interested in the stressful events and where they're going to be associated with future expectations, and if parental monitoring would sort of help buffer some of that relationship. We did not find a statistically significant relationship between stressful events and future expectations. This is one indication of resilience. These are kids, as I said, 99% of the kids had at least one of those things happen to them, but they still had this positive sense, I'm going to do a lot of things in my future. We did find an inverse relation between stressful events and parental monitoring. Now, this is correlational, so you can't say causing, but you say as stressful events go up, parental monitoring goes down, or the opposite. As parental monitoring goes up, stressful events go down. We also found that kids who were monitored more had higher future expectations. And so a quick sort of side note for anybody who's a parent here, when your kids say you're bugging me about yada, 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 it works. And that's just the same thing I just showed you, but in the correlation table. Other things, age was also associated with parental monitoring, which means older students were monitored more than younger students. Parental monitoring was also correlated with sex. As I said before, girls were monitored more than boys. Parental monitoring had the inverse relation with stressful events, as I said before. And parental monitoring was associated with future expectations. Again, if you're bugging your children about where they're going and what they're doing, it has a good outcome. They may not like you for that evening, but in the long run, it'll be okay. We also looked at this using more sophisticated statistical techniques, hierarchical regression models, where we sort of analyzed the data, standardized data, and sort of the standards of the field. Age and single-parent household were considered the control variables. We put in gender, parental monitoring, and stressful events. I mean, what are those main effects in terms of the main things that are happening? Then we put in our interactions in terms of how do these things sort of interact together in terms of looking at some of those things. And I will show you in terms of graphs versus the actual data. Overall, parental monitoring did buffer stressful events and future expectations. That top line is high parental monitoring, and then that bottom line is low parental monitoring. And as you see, future expectations rise as high parental monitoring rises as well. But I would also add a caveat to that. That difference was basically because of gender. And this is the same thing looking at the total parental monitoring by stressful events for males and females. And on your left, you have females, and that pinkish line is high monitoring. And you can see a basic finding that students who are monitored more have higher future expectations. But then you have this very interesting interaction between boys. As high monitoring goes up, it happens. But if boys are not monitored, they're actually much more vulnerable to some of those stressful events too. And so we do know that girls are monitored more than boys. Older adolescents were monitored more than younger adolescents. So basically, older adolescent females reported a higher parental monitoring than any other group in the sample. But an interesting point to consider is that parental monitoring had a greater impact on the future expectations of males than females. So we posit that African American males and females have different experiences in their social context, and that parenting strategies actually may be quite different or be gender specific in order to buffer their children to account for gender specific experiences that males and females encounter. I want to move to the next example, and I apologize if I'm going too fast. If I'm going too fast, please say, hey, slow up. I mean, you with me still? Yeah. Oh, good. Now, this example is going to focus only on females. It is to understand the resilience in African American adolescent females. Again, I want to emphasize that resilient youth tend to seek out support. And for girls, this support oftentimes is an adult woman, mom, aunt, grandmother, or a female teacher. Resilient youth also adjust well to new challenges. They have this sense of like, I can do these new and unusual things and do it with ease. Now, we also know that social support and ego resiliency are going to be examined here as sort of protective factors. So we're going to look at sort of kids who are exposed to adversity, but if you have social support or have this strong sense of I can do some stuff, that's going to protect me from that exposure in terms of depressive symptoms. We're looking at negative life events that are common, as I just talked about. Those stressful events that I just talked about in the first example are the same ones here. And depressive symptoms as an outcome. And again, I'm looking at depressive symptoms for this particular example because girls tend to present with depressive symptoms at higher numbers during adolescence than boys. And they're much more vulnerable to that too. So this is sort of that conceptual model. Thinking about negative events should have that direct relation to depressive symptoms, but either social support in terms of from mom, dad, or from a grandparent, or having a strong sense of ego would sort of help protect you from some of those negative things. And that's just what I just explained. I want to talk real briefly about African American girls as well. And one of the things we know about African American girls is that urban African American girls struggle to find someone willing to give attention and listen to their voice. Now, this is counter to a lot of the research about the struggles of silence that noted about white American girls. You know, Carol Gilligan came out in the 80s about how, you know, girls have a different voice, and it was very helpful in helping us understand sort of cognition and moral development. But we also know that urban girls are not silent. They'll tell you exactly what's going on. As I mentioned earlier, there are differences in gender differences in identity. The desire to maintain connections and strengthen relationships defines the way women define self as well, the sense of self. And this is different, again, than these notions of autonomy and independence that is associated with adolescence. And so girls want to define themselves in their relationships with other people. And, you know, again, if I go back to my undergraduate adolescent psychology class, we'll talk about Mean Girls. One of the reasons why Mean Girls, that movie, was so impactful, because it really showed how social networks in girls are much different than social networks in boys. Girls tend to have a smaller number of best friends. They tend to know each other better, so if they want to be mean to each other, they can really do each other in. This is much different than boys. Boys tend to have a larger number of best friends. And so if we get mad at one and say, oh, I got 10 others, I just go play basketball and I'm okay. And we tend not to know each other as well. This study had 136 females, around 16, large southern urban city. You guess which one. They were high achieving, as I said before, because they went to the science and math high school, but they still were Orleans Parish students. Many came from low income homes. They attended two schools. Again, the negative life events. Some more examples. One or two people I knew were killed. Parents started having an alcohol problem. I broke up with a girlfriend or boyfriend or some of those things. We looked at social support for mom, dad, and grandparent. And in my new study, we broke up grandparent between grandmother and grandfather. Because I really think this grandparent, the way people answered this, was actually this grandma. And so we did some stuff in rural Louisiana, post-Katrina, that I'm not going to talk about, but we broke up that grandparent one. And again, looking at ego resiliency, I'm generous with my friends. I enjoy dealing with new and unusual things. And depressive symptoms. My family life is happy. Sometimes I think I'm no good at all. I thought about killing myself. And you think about these things in terms of what's happened within the last 2 weeks. And we call these symptoms because in that depression, because if you were actually depressed, you'd have to go through a clinical interview and as well. And so we talk about symptoms because these are self-reported. The participants report experiencing few negative events. On all overall, the mean was 4.4, and the scores range from 0, no exposure to all, to 14, experiencing 14 events out of the 34 events. 45 or between 45.5% of the sample report experiencing 5 or more negative events within the last year. And some of the examples are about 42% had increased in the number of arguments with their parents. That's just typical adolescents. Parents and adolescents are going to have some challenges. 37.5 knew at least 1 or 2 people who were killed within the last year. And this is not from TV. This is saying 1 or 2 people in my neighborhood was killed. I know these people personally. 22.8 reported the death of a close friend. 18.4 reported the incarceration of a close friend as well. But at the same time, there were low depressive symptoms. And which you would expect, this is also a community sample. This is not a clinical sample. Most of us are not depressed. And so you wouldn't expect us to be off the boat in terms of depression. But they were high also in ego resiliency. These are girls who said, yes, I can do some things and I'm going to go out there and be somebody. They also reported high social support, with the highest social support coming from mom, second from grandparent, that's really why I think that was, that was grandmother, and third from dad. Again, looking at that relation in terms of negative events to depressive symptoms, and if social support, well, ego resiliency would serve as a buffer between those two things. Again, we did hierarchical regressions, and we did find that social support had an inverse relation, meaning when mom's support was low, depressive symptom was high. Or you could also talk about the opposite. When mom's support was high, depressive symptoms was low. And you found the same effect for dad. When dad's support is low, depressive symptoms is high, or the opposite. When dad's support is high, depressive symptoms are low. We did not find a significant relation with grandparent. There was a statistically significant interaction between mom's support and negative events, but not dad's support. And as you see here, that top line is low support. Yeah, low support. And you think, and so depressive symptoms rise under conditions of high negative events if you have low support. But if you have high support from mom, depressive symptoms lower under those conditions as well. So mom is serving as a buffer to those negative things that are happening. Then we looked at that same thing in terms of ego resiliency. What about that personal sense of, I can do all those things, but I act in the same way? And we did find there was a main effect that these girls who had this strong sense of who I am, also they reported lower depressive symptoms, and the opposite. But that interaction was not statistically significant. And then we said, let's look at this interaction between this sense of who I am in terms of ego and mom support and dad support to see if there's a difference. Now, before, remember I said that there was an interaction between sort of low and high mom support that sort of buffered things as well, overall. But dad was not statistically significant. Now, we look at this thing between low and high mom support ego in terms of girls who had this strong sense of who I am and a lower sense of who I am. Mom support was not interacting with that, but dad was. And really interesting here, you'll see from that top line is when there's a low ego from dad, when girls with low ego, when they have dad support, depressive symptoms go down. But girls who have the strong sense of who they were, regardless of what dad, they're okay. So dad support is really important for some of those girls who were not sure about who they were and what's going on. And so that brought up more questions. One, why dad only? And the importance of mom and other adult females should not be forgotten. Remember that the means were higher for mom and for grandparents than they were for dad. Now, this really could be that dad's support was critical for these low ego girls. So it could be that mom is saying to dad, hey, young girl is having some challenges. Get your buddy there and talk to her. Or, as a male, I would hope that dad is also saying, my daughter needs my help. Let me go and help her as well. Now to my last example, because I know I'm right on time, I think. The relations of school support, parental involvement, and future academic expectations as well. Now again, I want to talk about this notion of support. Now I talked about it just now, support from mom, dad, and grandparent. Now I want to talk about social support from teachers, school administrators, and coaches, and also look at parental involvement and how those two sort of interact to look at these resilient outcomes. And that's the resilient academic outcomes in terms of how far do I want to go to college? Do I want to drop out tomorrow? Or do I want to go to graduate or professional school after college? And then look at gender and socioeconomic status differences as well. Again, the same sample of 206 students, about 15, 16 years old. They were seen in small groups to their science and math schools, same kind of procedures. We looked at this parental involvement measure of school involvement. It's like, questions parents' involvement in the schoolwork only. Sort of checking homework, going to teacher meetings. We looked at perceived support, again, from teachers, administrators, and coaches. And future academic expectation was actually just one question, saying how many years do you expect to go in school? Do I want to drop out tomorrow, or I want to go to graduate professional school after college? Socioeconomic status is a combination of mom's education and parental household single-parent status, and then student self-reported male or female. There were gender differences in terms of future academic expectations. Males had a mean about 4.54, and females had a mean about 4.65. So females actually wanted to go a little bit further in their college. Students in lower grades were from families with lower SES as well. And so some of the younger students came from families with more challenges. And future academic expectations were inversely associated with parental involvement. Now that's a really interesting one, because you think that more parental involvement, the further you want to go in school. We actually find the opposite. It's that, the less parental involvement, the more these kids want to go to school. But these are also adolescents now, and one of the things we do know about parents and adolescents is that parents tend to trust schools to do the job. And especially during high school. The elementary, parents are there, and kids want their parents there in elementary. It's like every little child is very proud to have mom or dad pass out the cupcakes when you're in second grade. When you're in 11th grade, it's like, mom and dad, don't come here. If you do come, what are you wearing? Can you let me know first? Future academic expectations were positively associated with school support as well. And overall, though, the majority of these students expected to go to college and graduate or professional school after college as well. So we're also talking about a skewed group. We're talking about a group that is identified as, yes, I am going to college. I am going to graduate or professional school after college, overwhelmingly. And the first group was sort of high school, trade or vocational school, and no female said they wanted to go to trade or vocational school. Maybe one female said high school is enough for me. The majority of the students said, yes, I'm going to college, or I'm going to graduate and professional school. More females said, I'm going to graduate and professional school after college. We can also see that the differences, the results of school social support and parental involvement by gender, and these differences aren't statistically significant, but it's interesting to note that males reported more school support than females, even though that difference is not statistically significant. They're reporting more. And girls are reporting more parental involvement, although that difference is not statistically significant. But then we looked at this interaction between parental involvement and school social support. And that top line is low parental involvement, and that bottom line is high parental involvement. And again, these are students who are doing quite well. And the outcome, again, is sort of how far do you want to go in school. And so those students who are doing quite well, that make a difference. But the students who are not, who have low school support, parents are stepping in a little bit to sort of help out. So it is saying something. It's like, okay, well, parents are letting the school do the job. But if kids are perceiving low support in school, that's when parents are sort of stepping in, and it is having an impact somehow as well. Again, looking at that difference between sex and parental involvement, that top line is female, and the bottom line is males, basically showing that females are having more parental involvement. Now, there's a really interesting SES, or socioeconomic status, gender, and parental involvement interaction. And you see for males, again, you see that top line is low involvement. And the high involvement under high SES situations, actually, those males have lower future academic expectations. And that could just mean the difference. I want to go to college versus graduate or professional school. I mean, so we have to keep that in mind as well. But for females, we see what we would expect, in that when high parental involvement and high SES and high social support, you have better academic outcomes. So the gender differences in parental involvement raise more questions. It makes us think about the contextual experiences of males, and especially African American males. And it's really interesting that when we think about this nationally, the group of adolescents who are most vulnerable to attempting suicide are middle-income African American males. And we need to have more research and more questions to deal with some of those issues as well. And I think part of the issue is that we're raising good humans. And sometimes these middle-income African-American males are being raised as good humans, and they go out to the mall, and people don't distinguish them from being the son or daughter of someone who's a medical doctor, or a son or daughter or someone who's not. And they have a hard time dealing with some of those issues. But that's an empirical questions. All the students, though, reported support from the school officials. Now, this is also counter to the literature. The literature talks about how black students aren't seeing a lot of support from the schools. This data actually shows the opposite. When schools are supportive of their students, really good things happen. High academic future expectations were also associated with high school support, and academic future expectations were high regardless of parental involvement, and there was no school support time parental involvement, though. So my concluding remarks, when we think about these gender-specific patterns for understanding, we think about this in terms of gender-specific patterns for understanding resilience, vulnerability, and defiance. And pre-Levee failure examples of resilience were associated with social support from school, with parental support, and parental monitoring. So bug your parents, make sure teachers are supportive of the students, and the parents need to support kids in different ways as well. And that's just current stuff we're talking about there. The last slide I want to leave with is sort of new questions that we need to start thinking about as well, is that we need to start thinking about this notion of untested privilege. And this was very evident post-Katrina, that more African Americans in the city were impacted than any other group. They were more optimistic about returning, more optimistic about rebuilding. The people who had the biggest challenge post-Katrina were those who had untested privilege. They had no adversity in their life. This is the first time they lost their job, lost their house. I cannot cope. Many public housing residents, were marching and organizing, said, "Let me back in." People in the Ninth Ward had signs made, don't bulldoze my home without my consent. And so these people demonstrate notions of resilience in the face of adversity. There were people in other parts of the city who had good insurance who said, "Look, I can't deal with this." So this notion of untested privilege may need to be examined a little bit more as well. I do want to acknowledge the New Orleans Public Schools, and especially the Center for Science and Math, that's now Psi Academy. Some of my former and current graduate and undergraduate students, grants from the Department of Psychology and from Tulane, and local families and students for participating as well, because all of this stuff is really influential and very helpful to me. And that's my email address if you have questions. Unfortunately, I have to leave at lunch to go to a conference tomorrow, so I'll be around to lunch, though. Thank you.